You're listening to TBR Radio Presents the Dixie Heritage Hour with your host, the Director of Dixie Heritage, Dr. Ed DeVries.
It ceases to amaze me who reads the Dixie Heritage newsletter, our free weekly email newsletter. As we mention in every broadcast, if you'll go to www.dixieheritage.net, you can sign up to receive that newsletter absolutely free of charge. Most of our listeners have probably already done so, but if you have not, please, we encourage you to do that. And every weekend, Fridays, some great information comes to your email inbox. But it never ceases to amaze me, some of the amazing people who have subscribed to the Dixie Heritage newsletter these last few years. In fact, all of the guests that we've had here on TBR Radio Presents the Dixie Heritage Hour have been Dixie Heritage newsletter subscribers. And so they all subscribe to our newsletter or they have it one time. So that's just phenomenal to think about it. And I started getting emails from someone in Great Britain, realized that I was getting emails from somebody who is very prominent in the social circles, as well as in the nobility of the British nation. And I thought, wow, and these emails made it very apparent to me that she's been reading the newsletter for some time, and she's very aware of the things that I'm writing and sharing in those newsletters, and even suggesting some things that maybe we would want to start covering in the future, and actually very poignant suggestions. And I thought, I have got to get her on the radio broadcast. And so I asked her, and she was very gracious, and she sat for about 2 hours. Lady Michelle Renouf and I spoke on the phone, and I recorded what will be this week's broadcast, and then also next week's broadcast of TBR Radio Presents the Dixie Heritage Hour. Lady Michelle has a tremendous resume for being someone who is knowledgeable of the things she speaks about. In fact, her husband was the head of the British banking system for a time. He was the head of the Bank of New Zealand. He was also the person who was appointed by the Crown to restore the banking system of Germany after the Second World War. In other words, it was his job to take the German banking system, which had left the Rothschild central banker, fiat money, fake money, conspiracy banking system before the Second World War, and to bring Germany back in to that criminal enterprise known as the central banking system. When he was doing that, and even for the number of years, Lady Michelle said she was kind of ignorant of things, but over the years she heard things in conversation, just having access to the social circles that ordinary people would not have access to, and she heard things even in passing, and she began to realize just how wicked that banking system was. And so now, in her what we would call it retirement, she's working far more now than she ever did before retirement. She is exposing the evil of the things that she had basically learned about as a socialite there in England and throughout the United Kingdom and the Commonwealth nations and so forth. And so she's speaking of things not as somebody who has read about them in magazines or read about them in books or documentaries and so forth, but she's actually somebody who knows the players and was exposed firsthand to their conversations, and she reveals these things. Also, Lady Michelle was a movie actress and a commercial actress for a number of years, and still is. But she's moved to the other side of the camera. She's actually someone now who's making the documentaries, exposing the New World Order and exposing the banking system and exposing the evil. And so I know you'll want to stay tuned for the next 55 minutes. Our guest today is Lady Michelle Renouf. Lady Michelle, why don't you start by explaining to our audience how you have the title Lady?
It's a courtesy title from Her Majesty the Queen, because I married a Knight of the Realm, Sir Frank Renouf, a New Zealander who, as it happens, I was, at that time, in 1991, I was quite politically ignorant. And had I realized that he had helped reconstruct the German banking system after the war, I probably would have regarded it as an impediment to marriage. Because, in fact, what had happened during the 1930s and 40s to take us out of the international banking system of the Rothschilds was an extremely wise thing. And unfortunately, he helped relink all of that. But that's how I happened to have the courtesy title through my husband's connection to royalty and the title given to a knight.
I remember this was some time ago, so my memory of it is a little shaky, but I'm sure yours is intact. You were a member or a descendant from the Russian royal family. Did I read that correctly?
That is through my first husband. His family, in the Russian encyclopedia, they date back to the period of Ivan the Terrible. There's a story there about how the Griaznovs, Griaznov means the dirty one, and that was the title of the family. And of course, in that period, when the French diplomacy was emulated by Russian courts, those people would have been called counts, and that's how the title count came into being in the Russian ascendancy there. But it's quite a famous name, and sometimes when I go to the Russian embassy, they are quite taken by if I were to use my former husband's name, because it's a sort of it's an historic connection there, because the general Griaznov blew up the port of Odessa when he fled with his troops in the Russian Revolution, and so the name was changed to protect those the family. And therefore, the press get it wrong when they think that we invented the word Griaznov. It was the other word, which was the patronymic. Russians have a patronymic. Their father's name becomes their middle name. And so the patronymic was used because he was fleeing with his troops. So it's a very interesting background that they have, and quite a political one. One learned a lot from that family about politics.
How did you come to be associated with the Barnes Review? You're on the board of contributing editors for TBR magazine. How did that come about?
Well, it was Willis Carter, of course, in the early days when I was invited to speak at some of the conferences and so on. And of course, how I come into this situation at all is because I've acted in television commercials since age 15 internationally. And I have been an advertising model since childhood. So I apply what I would call swindle speak, what is advertising speak, to politics, and see that there is a great connection between how we are missold by clever packaging to buy ideas that in fact are not necessarily in our interests. And that is how I come to this subject in a very curious kind of background.
You said that you were not politically active at the time you got married, and obviously you are now. Was there a singular event, or was there a series of events? What is it that made you go from being apolitical to very political?
Well, it was a word, the word tyranny, just a word. Because it had nothing, I had no preconceived ideas of all sorts of things at all. I was almost a clean slate, as it were. But I happened to be on the advisory board of Shakespeare's Globe when it was being reconstructed by Sam Wanamaker some years ago, when actually the Admiral Crowe, the late Admiral Crowe, who was a former head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff at the Pentagon, he was very instrumental in helping me do a lot of work for the Shakespeare's Globe at that time. And it was because they had asked me to chair the major fundraising event that I came across tyranny, totally unexpectedly, without any form of prejudice, without any form of notions at all. And it was because I had presented the idea of suckling pig as something that the caterers had suggested. I wanted to have a choice in the main course menu because they had already decided that the ticket was going to be £200 to £500 a ticket, which was at that time in 1997 or thereabouts. I've forgotten quite in the 90s. That was a very high ticket, and to sell, since I'd done a lot of charity work all my life, either performing as a ballet dancer, which is another string to my bow, as it were, or as a chairman for fundraising events, they had asked me to do this. And of course, when I offered this choice, one woman said that I was being tyrannical if I offered a choice. Shortly after that, I was invited to Wagner's Bayreuth Festival by the late Prince Dragazi, whose family had also helped fundraise for the building of Wagner's opera house there in Bayreuth. During the interval, a young Greek boy was handing out leaflets about an event that was going to be at the Netherlands University called "Why Was Wagner the Dangerous Artist?" And then I thought, well, if I've got something in common with Richard Wagner, I simply must go along to find out what in the world this is all about. And I saw the same fear, this extraordinary fear, and that is what awakened me. And then, of course, eventually I wrote a monograph on Wagner, Artwork of the Future and Conspiratorial or Inspirational. And that, I have to say, my little monograph was banned for 2 days in Arizona University.
Okay.
So I have the great accolade, as it were, of being banned for 2 days in America, the land of the free, and so on. It rather escalated from there, and very quickly I began to see the swindle speak that's in politics is rife, and it's all basically advertising. It's all basically a house of cards.
I know that I want to be careful here how I don't really want to ask you a series of questions, but I do kind of want you to tell us what you can tell us about the situation. I guess you've all but been banned perhaps in Germany as well.
No, I've not been banned. What happened to me is that I was charged during a speech I gave at the Dresden commemoration of the terror bombing there. I was charged and I was arrested and charged with what's called Volksverhetzung, which is incitement of the public, because of the factual statements that I made there. One is not allowed to make factual statements in Germany. That case is pending still.
So when you say factual statements, you're referring to basically anything that contradicts the official narrative of World War II.
Absolutely right. Yes, absolutely right. Targeting civilians since they got away with it in the Dresden Holocaust. That's what I said when I was in Germany, standing on the very spot where our allies, our all lies, as they call it, were led into believing that carpet bombing German civilians was somehow justified to end a war, when in fact the war was pretty much ended. Where I stood there with 300 other people to commemorate those that were murdered in that terrible burning alive. They were made into human tortures. The ground was so hot that the people's feet melted into the ground and they just simply stood there and burnt alive. That Holocaust of targeting civilians has continued unabated ever since in all these countries that we have gone into as allies to rob and pillage, countries that did not do us any harm. And most recently, I suppose our viewers will be interested to know of the award that we gave for Ursula Haberbeck. In January, we launched the inaugural Robert Forresson International Prize on what would have been his 90th birthday. And we gave it to Ursula Haberbeck, who will be next month already 1 year in prison in Germany for simply asking questions, politely asking questions. She is 90 years of age, and she is now behind bars for 2 or 3 years for asking questions. An extraordinary notion that should shock all of America, and in fact it should shock all of the world that thinks it's a democratic ethos, because in fact we simply do not have choice. We don't have choice in so many things that appear to give us choice, but in as usual, it's a swindle speak in which we are. It's only in broadcasts of this nature, Edward, that we have any chance, or if we go out onto the street, that the public have any chance of hearing other than a particular line. That is, as we all know, is the media line, which gives no other possibility for grasping what is going on in the world in real terms.
And that's why publications like the Barnes Review are so important. Of course, as you know, Lady Michelle, the Barnes Review's masthead for these many years has been bringing history into accord with facts. And so for just about 60 seconds or so, we're going to break for a quick commercial from the Barnes Review magazine, and then we'll be back with our guest, Lady Michelle. If you love listening to the Dixie Heritage Hour, then I know that you'll love reading the Barnes Review. The Barnes Review is one of my favorite magazines. I began reading the Barnes Review long before they became a sponsor here on the program. In the Barnes Review, you will read vignettes of man, from the prehistoric to the very recent, from forgotten races and civilizations to first-person accounts of World War II and the late Cold War. There's just not a more interesting magazine published today, nor a more significant and important subject than real history. So if you'll visit www.barnesreview.org, that's www.barnesreview.org, you can find out how you too can become a subscriber to the Barnes Review. You can subscribe to receive the Barnes Review by mail, or you can subscribe to receive the Barnes Review electronically in PDF editions. Or you can subscribe to receive both. That's what I do. So visit www.barnesreview.org and subscribe to the Barnes Review. How did you come upon the name of the award? I'm sure that the person whose name is honored in the award itself, there's probably quite a story there to tell.
Well, there certainly is, and Professor Robert Forrester, the late half French, half Scots academic, French academic, he certainly is someone whose blogspot should be looked at and studied very carefully by our viewers. He made his swan song, as it were, last year at Shepperton, where he was born. And in fact, he spoke at the Tehran Conference 2006, where I also spoke. And he's been persecuted for the last 40 years because of his pursuit of truth, or simply exactitude, as he calls it, about what is called this unique mass murder weapon called the homicidal gas chamber. And that he has dedicated his last 40 years to examining. For that, he's received 10 physical attacks on his person. He's been cripplingly fined, very, very heavy fines that they impose upon revisionists, as they call themselves, in France. It's really a revelation to understand what we are not allowed to know and hear about. And in fact, as he always says, religion, the secular religion that we all have to believe in, on penalty of many, many punishments, is what he calls the sword and shield, which preventing international justice for historical truth and international justice for all of us. Because we see, even today in the news, there is this Omar Bugatti, who has been now today refused entry into the USA because he was the founder of the boycott. Peaceful boycotting it actually puts me in mind actually of a lot of the information that I have, which I've recorded over the years. I started on one side of the camera all of my life, and then when I found that I came across people who were telling the truth that was not of interest to the BBC, that I realized that I must somehow record these people. And so I began what I call telling films, so that I have quite unique footage of some of these people, some of them dead now. And one of them was a man called Sourani. He was coming to America some years ago to receive, a Palestinian, to receive an award, a human rights award. But the powers that should not be in America prevented him from coming. And finally, when the Americans, who said, of course, we must have the rights of our Constitution respected, finally, Mr. Sourani was able to come, but he was so supervised that he wasn't allowed to speak to any press or anyone at all to receive his award, and then had to leave the country instantly, because there's such a fear of people finding out the other side of the stories that the Hollywood stories that we are not allowed to give. And of course, your programs certainly do, and that's the beauty of the Barnes Review, because the idea is to bring history in accord with the facts. That was what Robert Forresson had wishes to do, and that's what his prize intends to do, and the reason why I try to collect as much archive of these type of champions for now and for the future.
You had emailed me recently that you're working on a film right now.
Yes, and that's the film, Edward. It's I will probably release it next month because it will it will commemorate the first year for Ursula Haverbeck, who was the recipient of the first award. She will have been in prison, age 90, for doing nothing at all save asking questions. And she will have been there for 1 year. This is what we're doing now and allowing now in Europe. People who ask questions, never committed any crime, never did anything other than ask historical questions and require answers in a civil manner. Into that film, I am putting a lot of excerpts of the interviews that I've collected over the years. For example, Professor Arthur Butz, one of your professors in America, who wrote the hoax of the 20th century concerning this unique mass murder weapon that no one is allowed to know anything about or query in legal terms across Europe. If you query it, you will be imprisoned for many, many years, and yet the law does not stipulate precisely what it is. It is something that is beyond normal understanding, especially for Americans, to understand that we can be imprisoned for querying something, just asking questions. There is, I hope, going to be considerable interest in this film because it will bring to light so many of the activists who have tried to give us the other side of the story that is not the Hollywood version.
So how does someone find your films? Is there a place on the internet they can go to?
Yes, tellingfilms.co.uk. The first DVD that I put out was called Jailing Opinions. Someone liked it so much that he started a website to promote it. And in fact, it's his website, though it's about my film. So it's the three W's Jailing Opinions, JAILING, as in the American spelling, opinions, OPINIOS.com. There you will find the origin of what you first asked me about. How in the world did I come to be how would an international television commercial actress become involved in politics? And that gives you that background. And my own website is called jewishrepublic.com because it's a campaign website to promote the first Jewish homeland, because there has been one in existence peacefully since 1928. The Jewish Republic is called Birobidzhan. It's on the southeast border of Russia. It was given to them peacefully in 1928 by Stalin. There was nothing anti-Semitic about it. Each ethnicity that comprised the Soviet Union at that time was given their own regions, their oblasts. And that one exists. It's not like the Madagascar idea, or which were ideas for Jews to go to. This is a place. And as a matter of fact, the late Colonel Gaddafi, 1 month before he was murdered, he was going to help me reach representatives of each of the countries that comprise the United Nations that though it is a Jewish initiative, nevertheless, it's possible for a resolution to be called for, which would get over the fear barrier and the inertia, the two obstacles to truth and justice, by calling for a recognition of the first Jewish homeland, Birobidzhan, and though it seems to be a very long shot, nevertheless, if all the nations of the world were to combine to do such a sensible thing, we would undermine the terrible tyranny, what is called the New World Order. This could be done peacefully.
Well, you talk about the New World Order and you talk about the Allies and the needless wars. The Queen is not as young as she used to be, and so obviously that's becoming a topic of conversation in your country. And this is my personal opinion, and you could correct me if I'm wrong. If Charles becomes the next monarch, I guarantee that the New World Order continues unabated and the wars continue and the interference continues. But what if it could skip a generation? What if, say, William were to become the king? Do you think that there could be a correction of course, or do you think that everything will just go on as it has been?
I would think it'd be infinitely worse if William, he's even more New World Order mindful, but it wouldn't make any difference. The thing is that all these wars we have had for so many years have caused our countries to be in hock to the bankers, and the bankers therefore own our countries, economically speaking. And so those who seem to be representing the heads of our nations are in fact at the same mercy as the rest of the country to those who own the country. And that is why it's such a disaster that we have fallen foul of their agenda. Create jealousies among the nations, bank both sides, and with our terrible power of the purse, we will own these countries. And that is in fact what is happening. Now we see with the EU, the maps, the European Union maps, and why we need Brexit is because our nation states, our heritage, all of the history and the culture across Europe, which is the basis of America and the colonies, like Australia and so on, that is to be, those countries are to be wiped off the map, literally wiped off the European Union maps. I mean, I've got some of them here. If you go to the official website, you will see these type of maps where they say that they have taken off the borders which have been created over the centuries to remove the history of our nations because they want to replace them with regions so that these regions will stop aliens from feeling alienated by our history. I mean, it's blatant, really, what they have in mind to do. And it really, we are being sold our own destruction on the nice idea of being an international citizen, whereas most of us would either starve or be killed in most parts of the world if left to nature. So we cannot be international citizens. We do belong to certain parts of the world, and the cultures are created around our racial characteristics, and these are things that we are being missold to throw away for slogans, for swindle-speak slogans that appeal to us as a fashion. It is all advertising. So is the banking system. It's all a house of cards as well. We are frightened of something that we can really expose. If only we could get over the fear barrier and the inertia barrier. One of the reasons why I admire Nigel Farage and what he's done to bring forth Brexit, and now that we know the treachery behind that has been brought out very clearly by May, Merkel and all these people, it's really, we really are lacking the information that the people need. And so really, I would like to dedicate our little talk together today, Edward, to the people who come out on the streets, who will, the yellow vest people, the genuine yellow vest people in France, the genuine people for Brexit, to come out and try to undermine the fact that we have such a biased media that doesn't tell us the truth of what's going on, so that we make the wrong choices because we're given the wrong premise. We really, people like Julian Assange and so on. I mean, we have now all this distraction. Why now do we have to hear this terrible arrest of Julian Assange? Could it be because it wants to distract the public now from Brexit and the fact that there has been treachery, and that we who voted for a democratic right to make a choice, and now we've been denied it. For the last 3 years, we've been denied it. And now we're being distracted by this idiotic arrest of a whistleblower like Julian Assange. Really, my website, jewishrepublic.com, celebrates people who are whistleblowers, who will stand up and try to show that we are we're just simply being swindled by false advertising.
Extra, extra, read all about it.
If you're like me, and I'll bet you are because you're listening to the Dixie Heritage Hour, you like to be on the cutting edge of honest news and accurate information. You like to hear about the latest financial trends and to know what's happening around the world and right here in the United States. The things that can directly impact you, your life, and the life of your family. And if you're like me, you do not rely on the mainstream media to obtain this information because, frankly, you know that you just can't trust them. Fortunately, there is an alternative news outlet with a long-established track record for honesty and integrity, and that is the American Free Press. AFP is the preeminent alternative, independent news source for honest, hard-working, truth-loving Americans. AFP is the antithesis of the controlled, lamestream media. AFP is employee-owned and has been so since its founding. Because of that, AFP never has and never will allow advertisers or special interests or big money to dictate what appears in the pages of the American Free Press newspaper. 26 times a year, the American Free Press newspaper can be delivered to your door, packed with the kind of uncensored news that I know you're going to appreciate. AFP covers the stories and tells the truth that the lamestream media is frankly scared to touch. And AFP offers real, on-the-scene reporting and commentary, the likes of which you will never see in the Washington Post, the New York Times, ABC, NBC, CBS, CNN, or just about any other lamestream news source that you can think of. That's right, there's only one national populist news weekly staffed by an unsurpassed team of veteran investigative journalists who will dare to rip the veil off of many of the major news stories that are being censored and suppressed by the big money controlled media monopoly. And that's the American Free Press. AFP publishes exciting, in-depth, uncensored news and information that's grassroots and patriotic, information that Americans need to know in order to combat the growing police state. AFP stands firmly against the New World Order and against those who are working to establish a global plantation under the rule of a powerful few. In short, AFP is your voice. If you have any doubt why they want to silence AFP, you must be relying on the lamestream media for your news, and folks, that's a big mistake. If you're ever dissatisfied with your subscription to the American Free Press, their guarantee is that you just drop them an email and they will gladly refund the unused portion of your subscription. So what are you waiting for? Visit www.americanfreepress.net. Once again, www.americanfreepress.net. And find out about the American Free Press. Do it today.
Extra, extra, read all about it.
I can't figure out the whole Julian Assange situation myself, because you would think, if anything, that Donald Trump was very favored by the publication of the information that he posted.
Yes, well, he's been a very big disappointment to it, hasn't he? He said he was going to clear the swamp, and he's joined it. Really.
And the other thing that surprises me is what they've actually arrested Julian Assange for is conspiracy with a person named Chelsea Manning, and President Trump pardoned Chelsea Manning at the beginning of his presidency.
Well, let's give Chelsea Manning his proper name rather than giving him a name that sort of this transgender thing, really. We are being driven away from common sense.
Well, you talk about the media. It's been so long since I've heard Manning's given birth name. I don't even remember what it is. Hopefully you do.
Well, for some reason they started calling this man she. As far as I know, there's not been any operation. And in any case, whether there's an operation or not, nature has decided whether we're male or female. And if there's a confusion for people, they simply need to look down. Wouldn't you say?
Yes.
You need to look. We are being driven into. You see, I have acted in, as I've said, with male models and so on all of my life. So I'm very familiar with what I call, and they themselves called, queers. And I had no objection in my entire life to queers because they knew they were queer. They didn't pretend to be anything else. In fact, they were rather proud to be whatever they were. But now we are, and they have been persuaded that they are normal. They are not normal. They are queer. People in the privacy of their own adult life are entitled to do what it is that they prefer, but they are queer. And now we are being persuaded you can change your sex just because you want to, and this is being introduced to little children in schools. My granddaughter, when I'm telling her about the story of Swan Lake and the ballet, she says that the prince could just as well have married another prince and lived happily ever after. And this is what she's being taught at age 6 and 7 in school. And I said, but marriage and to live happily ever after is in order to create a family. People need a family because that is the basic orientation for us in life. Here we are being robbed of normal common sense by this transgender lunacy and many other foolish ideas that are simple, like the international citizen, and all of these many notions that are undermining our race and our heritage and the propagation of it by promoting the notion of homosexual marriage. Absurd idea, since you cannot possibly. It takes a man and a woman to reproduce and make a family. So we're being disinherited of our normal behavior, and the same by introducing these ideas at a very influential age to confuse young people. And also we have the same negativity involved in feminism, where women are being dissuaded from the very greatest possible role there is in life, which is to reproduce a life and to create a family. Women are being persuaded that this is beneath their dignity. It is end game, and the end sum is that it's reducing our race and our rootedness in our own identity, which needs to be linked to something fundamental, not fashion and not fantasy, and not rings through people's noses and being told that this is beautiful when make women look like cows. And we're seeing the fashion of women, not emulating the common sense of man and how they made dress, but emulating a challenge to whores. I mean, the women are getting around now in ways that are just simply titillating or making a fool of themselves in front of men. This is not a good lesson from feminism. This is contrary to our best interest. It's a swindle.
The North Carolina Heritage Political Action Committee was organized by concerned citizens of North Carolina in 2015 in response to the increased attacks on North Carolina's history and heritage. The North Carolina Heritage PAC supports state and local candidates for public office who pledge and show their support for the protection of Confederate memorials and the preservation of all of North Carolina's history. We all know that Confederate memorials and symbols are the easy targets, and that the end game of our leftist enemies is to erase and rewrite all of history, from the colonies to the War on Terror. If we fight them for our state's rich Confederate history and heritage, we may be able to stop them from their mission of total destruction. Join the North Carolina Heritage PAC now by visiting ncheritagepac.org. Once again, that is www.ncheritagepac.org. And help us on the front lines of North Carolina politics. The mission statement of North Carolina Heritage PAC is that the North Carolina Heritage PAC was created with the purpose of supporting diverse efforts to defend and preserve the heritage, traditions, monuments, cemeteries, flags, emblems, and other legacies of North Carolina history against those efforts to remove, deface, legislate against, alter, and otherwise corrupt or pervert their meaning, history, presentation, and standing in our state. Once again, www.ncheritagepac.org. Harry and is it Meghan Markle?
Just brought into the British monarchy an alien race that has not existed, that is now misrepresenting our heritage. So he would be, yes, well, this is for people who have coming from the history of our sovereignty and so on, and our kings and queens. They are obliged to represent something. Their private lives are not relevant, but have been made relevant to us, as if they're some sort of celebrity, pop stars and so on. That's not their role. It's been fortunate that at least the Queen has tried to keep herself away from that kind of personalizing of her role. Her role is to act as representative of the monarch. It's not about being Mrs. Windsor. And there is a confusion as to what is the purpose of a state representative. When people bow to the Queen, they're not bowing to that person. They're bowing to the heritage that we are trying to maintain. And for Harry to bring into the racial inheritance of our civilization something that is completely alien, he's not acting in the interests of the monarchy. He is acting in the interests of the swindlers who have persuaded him that this kind of new world order and its sort of diversity, which will get rid of racial diversity, he is bringing the demise of our culture and our heritage and our race as a role model for something that is not in our interests at all, something that is simply not being allowed to be said. And yet again, another symptom of role models that are not, well, they're just swindling their own people by being ignorant of what is really being sold and missold to us in the guise of something that is not beneficial at all to any of the races, because the beauty of the planet is surely that we have all of our races and our cultures, not that we actually globalize and remove all that is that makes the planet truly diverse, as opposed to the very opposite, which will do away with diversity. We are being sold buyer beware was always the statement, and it should be adhered to. We should be buyer beware.
Well, the thing that's always kind of interested me is, for example, if you look at who attends Bilderberg meetings and you look at their families, even, let me take this a step further. Look at the president of Mexico and look at how fair-skinned he is, and how fair-skinned his wife is, and how fair-skinned his children are. For all of the push for diversity amongst the populaces of various countries and continents, the people who believe themselves to be the puppet masters are going out of their way to make sure that they maintain their racial purity.
Well, Disraeli famously said, "All is race." He pretended to be christened, but actually he continued to promote Rothschild. He was the one who ushered in Rothschild to misrepresent Britons in Parliament in 1858. We have been an occupied country ever since in Britain. These are people who try to present to us the notion of diversity and doing away with race at the same time as persisting in so-called anti-Semitism. The subject is enormous, Edward, but perhaps the best way to think about it would be recently the Bruges group in England. They are the Brexiteers and so on. Very good speakers they have and so on. And recently I got up at one of their events and I held up these maps that I've just shown you, these European Union maps, to show what the end game is of this EU. It's not all about business. European Union is not all about business. It's about ruining our heritage and our culture and our races. The Brexit people afterwards asked me, please, never to come to any of their meetings again. Yet a black Nigerian came up to me afterwards, an economist, and he said, I agree with what you said. In fact, he said, as an evangelical, unfortunately, he said, we are grateful to the white race because they brought to Africa Christianity. So he was fearless about talking about his race and didn't think that I needed to be crushed like I was being crushed because I wanted to speak up for my white race in Europe. But the downside of it is, of course, that this Nigerian economist is an evangelical. So, of course, he has bought into this fraudulent idea of Israel being the representative of the means by which Christianity is going to somehow convert the Jews, and therefore there's going to be this rapture and all these other crazy ideas that have nothing to do with the traditional Christianity. So there was an interesting, positive outcome to that, to my being banned from the Bruges group, and at the same time, the downside of what prompted this young man to come and defend me. Anyway, we are in lengthy talks together to try and get to the bottom of his accepting Israel as real estate, as opposed to Israel as a metaphysical idea.
Well, I've tried to explain that. In fact, I wrote an article that was published here in the United States not too long ago, and I explained that Israel in the Bible and the state of Israel today are two totally separate entities. One is a political construct that is totally unrelated to the other.
Yes.
And that there is no spiritual benefit to be derived by supporting the political construct in the Middle East. And I think that's why so many people are violently supportive of the political construct that we know as the state of Israel, because they equate it with Israel of the Bible and they think that there's some blessing of God to be obtained. I'm like, there is no such blessing to be had.
But I thought actually until recently that occurred with Vatican II Congress in the 60s, because I was doing a master's degree at the University of London at Haythrop College. It's a Jesuit college, the Haythrop College, where they were offering a course in the psychology of religion. It was a very interesting course. Of course, I knew on the second day when they said that the sole examiner who decides who will graduate is an Hasidic Jewess married to a rabbi. I knew immediately that there was no question that I was going to graduate. And eventually, I was asked to leave. But the reason I was asked to leave after 2 years of a very interesting course is because the principal of Haythrop had taken us to the Reform Synagogue, as it happens in St. John's Wood in London, where he spoke to the Jewish congregation, where he said that the two covenants stand. Now, the two covenants stand, A, one with the chosen people in the Old Testament, and B, with the people, all the people. No difference between Jew and Gentile. So I said to him, your speech there was rather like a T-shirt which says, Jesus loves you, but I'm his favorite. That is a two-tier arrangement which any father, much less a godfather, would figure out. And of course, eventually they just asked me to study elsewhere. But I learned a great deal on that course. Edward, my problem is that I'm an open book with too many footnotes. So I've now forgotten why I've raised this issue of this T-shirt to you.
Okay.
Where were we going before I took us all over the place?
Well, we were talking about how the political state of Israel and the Israel of the Bible were not the same. And
well, there we are. You see, so it's this idea that the two covenants stand, and that as Pope John Paul brought in the notion that the Jews are our senior brother. This is not the concept in Christianity at all. It's the very opposite. That they were fallen people who failed to they allowed vanity and greed for whatever you think about the Old Testament. And I have a great deal to say about that, but just let's put it down to their failure with vanity and greed to overcome our worst infantile aspects. And so the better part of Christianity is perhaps Buddhism, where we try to separate subjectivity from objectivity so that we have a chance of being just rather than infantile and selfish. But all of that kind of concept has gone completely out of the window in terms of how, for instance, America is governed. The power of America has now been turned not to Christian values or humane values or values of justice and so on, but just vanity and greed to own the world, to God bless America. What about the rest of the world? You know, it's the chosen idea. God bless us. You know, I mean, we have been led astray by swindle speak and just cheap, ordinary, common or garden advertising skills.
Breaker one, might be crazy, but I ain't dumb. Crazy Cooter coming at you. Hey, y'all, got your ears on? Well, I got some news for you. We're here at our brand new Cooters in the Country store in Sperryville, Virginia. Good old Sperryville, where Cooters started many years ago. Folks are coming from all over Hazard County, and we're going to have a grand old time with good music, good food, and best of all, good friends. Hope y'all can be there. Whoop, whoop, here come Enos. Huck got Cletus with her. I'm down and I'm gone.
as I said at the beginning of the broadcast, Lady Michelle and I spoke on the phone for a little over 2 hours. And so we have another full broadcast of TBR Radio Presents the Dixie Heritage Hour to share with you next week, which will be the conclusion of my interview with Lady Michelle, but we are going to cut it here this week because we are just about out of time for this week's program. I would like to thank you for having been our guest this week, and I know, of course, you'll want to come back next week, same bat time, same bat channel. However you're listening to TBR Radio Presents the Dixie Heritage Hour, come back the same time and place next week, and we'll have once again the conclusion of this very interesting conversation between myself and Lady Michelle Renouf. In fact, Lady Michelle just kind of hits the highlights in today's broadcast. There are a few specifics that next week she will go into great detail on. For example, she mentioned a lot of names in passing. She just, for example, mentioned Colonel Muammar Gaddafi in passing, and she said that he was murdered. In next week's broadcast, she will tell you exactly why he was murdered, why they wanted Muammar Gaddafi dead. What did Muammar Gaddafi do that made the bankers of this world, to whom all of the nations are indebted, what did Muammar Gaddafi do to make them so upset that basically the bankers told the leaders of the United States and Great Britain, Colonel Gaddafi needs to sleep with the fishes? And she'll tell us that. And she'll also go into deeper detail on some other things as well, so you'll definitely want to tune in next week. Would also like to encourage you to go to my website, www.dixieheritage.net. And again, sign up for the newsletter. When you do, we'll send you a free copy of my book, The Truth About the Confederate Battle Flag. And, of course, go to the Barnes Review website, barnesreview.org. Lady Michelle is on the board of editors for TBR Magazine, just as I am. And from time to time, she contributes articles. She also points some of us who are regular writers for TBR to things that are going on in Europe, things that we might not otherwise know about, or if it weren't for her pointing us in the right direction, we wouldn't know to be looking in certain areas, which also contributes greatly to the content that appears in the Barnes Review magazine. And so Lady Michelle is just a tremendous, interesting character, and I really, really enjoyed conversing with her. And I know that you'll enjoy listening next week just as you have this week. And what I want to do is just to close out the broadcast for the few remaining minutes that we have, I want to share just a little clip of some video of a conversation that Lady Michelle had recently had in another interview.
Dennis Richards was the official historian of the RAF, the Royal Air Force, in the Second World War, having been senior narrator in the historical section of the Air Ministry during most of the war. As Richards' obituary in The Guardian noted, his wartime role was to write confidential studies about operations for the benefit of the Air Ministry. This official history was eventually published in 3 volumes in 1953 and 54. This is a quote from it. The attack on the Ruhr by the British was therefore an informal invitation to the Luftwaffe to bomb London. The primary purpose of these raids was to goad the Germans into undertaking reprisal raids of a similar character on Britain. Such raids would arouse intense indignation in Britain against Germany and so create a war psychosis without which it would be impossible to carry on a modern war, end quote. This means, and there's another spokesman called Spate, I refer to both of them in my film Holocaust, Dresden Holocaust, An Apology to Germany is Due. This is the concept where the British policymakers had to goad another country to bomb Britain because they admit that Adolf Hitler did not want to bomb Britain. What kind of policymakers did we have in Britain that wanted to goad another country to bomb us? I just think that if the British understood that this was the policy of that crazy warmonger Churchill and co, it would make a difference to the British
in terms of how they think it was their finest hour, and who was the one who gave them their finest hour. Sure, they were very brave, there's no question of that, but they were utterly and completely duped and misled into doing something extremely wicked. And I think it necessary for the Germans themselves to understand that they did not start World War II and this bombing. It was not, and that they were Holocausted. Their citizens were Holocausted